Hi girls. We are on, can you believe it, chapter 16 of The Worst Witch, All at Sea. Things were seeming pretty at sea last time we were here. They'd had a lovely day at the beach and Mildred had snuck some kippers into her shorts, but she hadn't been able to deliver them to Tabby, so she was heading back with the hope of sneaking out again. So let's see how we go. An opportunity presented itself at dusk, as Form 2 were having an hour of leisure before going to bed. Maud was darning a hole in the toe of a sock, and Enid was reading a manual on broomstick water skiing, while the rest of the girls were bustling about, similarly employed. No one seemed to notice as Mildred slunk out of the door and made her way to the cliff steps. Here she is, looking pretty sneaky. She was halfway down when, to her horror, a voice called out from behind, making her jump out of her skin. It was Ethel. "Hey, Mildred," she called. "Mind if I join you?" No," said Mildred. "Of course not." "Where are you off to, then?" asked Ethel, with an unpleasant smile. "It's a bit dangerous on these steps, so I thought you might need some assistance with whatever it is. You know how clumsy you are." Ethel managed to say all this in a light, sincere tone of voice. If you hadn't known her, you would have thought she was genuinely concerned, instead of nosily trying to find out something secret. I was just going for a stroll on the beach," Mildred improvised. "I've got a bit of a headache, that's all." "Then why didn't you go to Miss Hardbroom?" said Ethel. "She'd have given you an aspirin or something." "No, I think you're up to something, Mildred Hubble, and I'm going to get Miss Hardbroom and tell her before it's too late and you get us all into trouble." They had reached the bottom of the steps by this time. "Look, Ethel," said Mildred, "if I tell you, will you promise not to let on? Even Maud and Enid don't know." Ethel considered the matter. She felt quite pleased at being let in on a secret, which even Mildred's best friends didn't know. "All right," she said. "I promise." "Okay," said Mildred, racking her brains for a good story. "You remember the story about the treasure out on Cat's Head Rock? Well, I was going to go out there on the boat and have a little look around to see if I could find it. It's a nice calm evening and it seemed a good idea. I thought the magician would be really pleased to have the treasure to buy things for the castle. I wasn't going to go now, maybe a bit later when everyone's asleep. I was just going to see if the boat's seaworthy." Ethel stared at Mildred. "Well, I think that's a dreadful idea," said Ethel. "The magician told us not to use the boat, and you'd probably wreck it or something. Anyway, there probably isn't any treasure at all. I say, Mildred, you do smell awful. Don't you think it would be more to the point if you went back to the castle and had a bath? You smell like a crate of rotting fish." "Actually," said Mildred, "I sat on a kipper this morning and haven't had time to wash my clothes. Perhaps you're right about the plan to get to the treasure. I think I'll go back to the dorm and forget all about it." They set off on the long climb back up the steps, Ethel leading the way. While Ethel's back was turned, Mildred took the kippers from her pocket and lobbed them onto the deck of the boat, meaning to come back after dark and give them to Tabby in the shelter. Here she is, throwing the kippers. I hope she's got a good aim. The window was just too narrow for him to squeeze out, though Mildred had seen him looking out during the day. Amazingly, no one else had noticed, and any mewing had been drowned by the sound of the waves and the seagulls and the shouts of the girls. Miss Hardbroom looked out of her window at the perfect evening sky and decided to take a broomstick ride. Here she is. Here's Miss Hardbroom. She rarely felt quite so pleased with life as she did today. For some reason, the warm weather and the delights of sea bathing had made her feel completely relaxed. Even the girls did not irritate her quite as much as usual, except for Mildred Hubble, of course. Mildred would have irritated Miss Hardbroom, whatever the weather was like. There was just something about that girl that just got to Miss Hardbroom, like a scratchy label sewn into the neck of a dress. It even annoyed Miss Hardbroom that they were only invited on the holiday in the first place because of Mildred's action in saving Mr. Rowan Webb from the pond. However, putting all irritation aside, Miss Hardbroom swirled her cape around her shoulders, commanded her broom to hover outside the window, and the cat, which was a particularly beautiful smooth black one with olive green eyes, named Morgana, to sit on the end and lowered herself onto it gracefully. "Away," she commanded, "to the cave." Mildred and Ethel had just reached the top of the steps, and they both ducked as Miss Hardbroom zoomed over their heads, rather like one of those low-flying fighter planes that sometimes appeared from nowhere where you're out walking in the country. Look at her, zooming past, scaring the girls. Miss Hardbroom did not see the two girls as she nose-dived down the cliff face and pulled up to the perfect landing next to the breakwater where the boat was tied. A chilly breeze was coming from the sea, and Miss Hardbroom wrapped her cloak around her as she put the broomstick into the cave to keep it from getting wet. At once, Morgana sprang purposefully onto the breakwater and ran along to the boat. She had smelt the kippers and couldn't wait to investigate. Look, there she is. With her little cat instincts, she can smell food. Miss Hardbroom was intrigued to see the cat disappear into the boat. She was even more intrigued when she heard a desperate yowling and saw the scruffy-looking Tabby madly trying to squeeze himself out of the few inches of open window in the shelter. Oh, poor Tabby was frantic with hunger, and the sight of Morgana eating his evening meal was too much to bear. Oh, no! Miss Hardbroom climbed aboard the boat to investigate. She recognised Tabby immediately, and her eyebrows knitted together like storm clouds as she made her way through the boat to the shelter. A slight breeze had come up, and the boat was bobbing and swaying, making it difficult to keep her balance. Miss Hardbroom had forgotten her own cat, now crouched underneath one of the benches, wolfing down the kippers as fast as possible. The boat lurched, and Miss Hardbroom unfortunately braced her foot on an unexpected piece of fish skin, which zipped her over backwards, banging her head on the seat as she fell. A shower of stars and exploding lights cascaded past her eyes, and she lost consciousness. Then there was no sound except for Tabby's pitiful mewing, Morgana's munching, and the sea slapping at the sides of the boat. Gosh, there she is, knocked unconscious. Uh-oh. Next chapter. Of course, Ethel hadn't believed Mildred when she said that she had given up on her plan to visit the rock. She felt quite sure that Mildred would go back again, perhaps after dark. Mildred was such a bad liar and schemer that she always gave herself away. Ethel could tell by the way Mildred kept glancing out of the window and wandering up and down the dormitory. Even Maud and Enid had noticed that something was wrong. Here's Mill, looking a little bit shifty. "What's the matter, Mill?" asked Maud. "You look so jumpy all the time." "Nothing," exclaimed Mildred in a falsely bright voice. Nothing at all. Ethel smiled secretly to herself. She had been a little worried in case Mildred actually did manage to take the boat to Cat's Head Rock and find the treasure. The thought of everyone praising Mildred's cleverness was just too upsetting for words. Of course, it was more likely that Mildred would sink the boat than find the treasure. But she just might do it. Well, thought Ethel, there's one surefire way to make sure she doesn't get the chance. Mildred decided to abandon Tabby's dinner for the night. She couldn't face another trip down the cliff, either by broomstick or on foot, so the best thing to do seemed to be to go to sleep and sneak out at the crack of dawn. She had completely forgotten the story she had made up to Ethel about the boat trip to Cat's Head Rock. In fact, she had completely forgotten Ethel until she saw her coming back into the dormitory with an "I know something you don't know" look all over her face. Here's that very look on her face. Ethel had obviously been out again. Her hair was windswept and she was wearing her cloak, which she folded neatly on top of her suitcase before she came and stood at the foot of Mildred's mat. "I wouldn't bother going on any trip if I were you," she announced. "What trip?" asked Mildred, confused for a moment. "Oh, yes, the trip to the rock. Yes, well, as I told you, I decided against it. You know best about these things, Ethel." "Just in case you change your mind," said Ethel darkly, "why don't you take a look out of the window?" Mildred sprang to her feet and peered out into the darkening night. She is. Far below, in the deep shadow of the cove, she could just make out the shape of the boat, no longer attached to the breakwater, making its way steadily out into the open sea. "Ethel, you... Well, words failed Mildred as she ran to the door, pulling on her cardigan and cloak over her pyjamas. "Oh, why can't you ever leave anything alone?" "Don't make such a fuss, Mildred," said Ethel, feeling a little embarrassed, as half the class were now propped up in their beds listening. "It's only a boat, for goodness sake." Only a boat, thought Mildred as she raced through the stone corridors and began the descent to the rickety steps. It says a lot for her desperation to rescue Tabby that she didn't stop to remember that she was afraid of the dark. Here she is, running. Gosh. Next chapter. Standing at the edge of the waves, with her eyes as wide open as possible, Mildred tried to gauge how far the boat had progressed. It certainly seemed a long way away, and the growing breeze was a little alarming, ruffling white crests onto the edge of the waves. Fortunately, a perfect full moon was rising above the horizon, casting a strong enough light to make Mildred less desperate about being out alone in the dark. There seemed to be nothing she could do. She couldn't even swim, not even doggy paddle. If only she had a broomstick. Suddenly, there was a loud meow from the cave. Mildred's heart leapt, first in fright, then for joy, as she thought that Tabby must have somehow got off the boat and be sheltering in the cave. Gosh, here's the bright full moon lighting the way. "Tabby!" she called as she ran to peer into the darkness. But the cat, which pattered out to rub itself against her ankles, was not a tabby, but a beautiful, sleek, black one. Mildred noticed the broomstick leaning against the wall just inside the cave as she bent down and picked up the cat. "Now, who do you belong to?" asked Mildred. "Hello? Is there anyone there?" she called into the dark corners of the cave. The complete stillness of the cave was her reply. The cat was now entwining itself round the broomstick, which Mildred caught as it toppled over sideways. "I know," she exclaimed as an idea struck her. "Here's your rescuer, Tabby. It won't take a minute on this to zoom out to the boat and bring you back. Perhaps I could even bring the boat back and no one would be any the wiser. She did wonder who the broomstick and the cat belonged to, but of course there was no reason to suppose that they were Miss Hardbroom's. Poor Mildred would have been even more terrified if she had known that she was setting out on Miss Hardbroom's best broomstick and that Miss Hardbroom herself was in the boat. "Oh, drat that Ethel," she muttered as she pulled her cape around her shoulders. "I know she didn't realise about Tabby, but it's still an awful thing to do, to unmoor a boat and just shove it out to sea. And I just know I'm bound to get the blame if it isn't back at the breakwater by the morning. You can stay here in this nice warm cave, little cat. I won't be long." Here she is, putting Morgana down. She pushed the cat firmly back into the cave as, to Mildred's surprise, it tried to jump onto the back of the broomstick, which was hovering patiently in mid-air as she had commanded it. "Off we go then," said Mildred, climbing on and giving the stick a brisk tap as they set off up the beach, skimming the waves like a hovercraft. Unfortunately, Mildred had forgotten about Miss Hardbroom's warning about the broomsticks not working if it was damp, and instead of rising above the water, she ploughed straight into it. There was enough air trapped under Mildred's cloak to hold her up amid the waves, giving her time to remember how Ethel had come to grief during the broomstick water skiing because she didn't hold it high above the water. It was very hard not to panic, but Mildred managed to tread water well enough to stop herself sinking. She grabbed the broomstick and held it as far up in the air as she could. "Fly! Please fly!" she gasped. "Off we go. Nice broom, beautiful broom, please!" As she is, calling out in need. Perhaps it was the flattery that did it. Despite the broomstick being completely waterlogged, very jerkily it rose above the waves, pulling Mildred out of the sea, water cascading from her clothes. "Stop!" Mildred shouted rather suddenly as she realised that they were now 10 feet in the air and rising. It had been difficult to tell how far they had risen because the moon had disappeared completely behind a sinister black cloud, and the night was suddenly very dark. Gosh, there she is. Mildred could hardly believe that she had got into quite such a dreadful situation. Hanging by both arms from a broomstick is extremely difficult, even when your clothes are not twice as heavy with water. Mildred realised that there was only a limited amount of time that she could hold on, so she had only one hope, and that was to find the boat and literally drop into it. From her vantage point in mid-air, she frantically peered all around into the pitch dark and tried to see where it was. To her great surprise, the broom suddenly gave a little twitch and set off in a most determined manner, as if it really knew where it was going. In fact, it did know where it was going. Magic broomsticks are very curious things if they are owned by one person for a very long time. And Miss Hardbroom had kept this particular one for 25 years. They develop a strange kind of intuition about their owners. In the same way that a dog will stand at the front door and wag its tail when its master is getting off a bus at the end of a street, a broomstick can sometimes sense that its owner is nearby. And if the owner is in trouble, the sense is even more acute. The broomstick flew on grimly until it stopped just as suddenly and hovered. Mildred felt desperate. "Oh, go on, broom," she said. "You were doing really well." But the broomstick didn't budge. Mildred's arms and fingers were almost numb with cold and pain from hanging on. She began to cry as she imagined the horror of being alone, unable to swim in the darkest of dark nights. It really was all her worst fears come true. Slowly, her fingers loosened their grip. She let go completely and fell through the black night air towards the waiting sea. Gosh, and that's the end of the chapter. Here she is, plummeting down. Oh gosh, I can't wait to find out what happens next. Until next time, girls, lots of love.